In a chilling reflection, the haunting truth emerged. The nonchalance with which the killer spoke of his crimes was disheartening. He revealed the thrill he derived from the act of killing, juxtaposed against a seemingly idyllic image of the Dardine family's home in Ina. In 1987, this quaint town in Illinois became the backdrop for an unspeakable tragedy. A pregnant woman, Ruby Elaine Dardine, was brutally beaten to death in a savage attack so violent that it triggered her labor. Tragically, she was not alone. Her entire family, including their young son Peter, would endure a similar fate. This case stands as one of the most disturbing I have ever encountered, and anyone who has delved into its depths would echo that sentiment. Stay with us as we unravel the haunting details surrounding the Dardine family. To comprehend the events that would unfold, we must first journey back to 1986. In that year, 29-year-old Russell Keith Dardine and his wife, Ruby Elaine Dardine, made their home in the small town of Ina, Illinois, along with their toddler Peter. Often they preferred to be called by their middle names, Keith and Elaine. The Dardines settled into a modest beige and white mobile home situated near Route 37, with the Illinois Central Railroad tracks just across the highway. At the time, Elaine was pregnant with their second child, a daughter they intended to name Casey. Both parents were busy with their lives. Keith worked as a treatment plant operator, while Elaine was employed at an office supply store. They were a close-knit family, deeply involved in their local Baptist church, where they even participated in the musical ensemble. Despite their modest means, the couple was wholeheartedly committed to securing a bright future for young Peter, investing a significant portion of their earnings into his college fund, even though he was just 2 years old. Keith demonstrated his dedication to family by reselling Kroger soda cans for 50 cents each. From this perspective, it was clear that Keith was a devoted family man, and their neighbors would readily attest to this. They noted that Keith and Elaine were always active in their community, and for a time, it seemed as if life was unfolding perfectly for the young family. Yet, beneath the surface, the neighborhood was anything but peaceful. A troubling surge in crime was sweeping through Jefferson County, home to approximately 38,577 residents. In just the previous 2 years, a shocking 15 murders had been reported. Among the most horrifying incidents was the rape and murder of a 10-year-old girl in May of 1987. But it wasn't just the recent violence that sent shivers down the spine. Ina, the town in which the Dardines resided, carried its own grim legacy. In 1924, 2 individuals were murdered by their spouses through arsenic poisoning. Then, in 1985, a man, under the influence of LSD, brutally killed his entire family. With this history looming over them, Keith felt an unsettling tension regarding the safety of his family. In May of 1987, a horrific crime unfolded: the rape and murder of a 10-year-old girl. But this was not an isolated incident. The town of Ina, where the Dardines lived, was steeped in a dark history that cast a shadow over its residents. A chilling case from 1924 still echoed in the streets, where 2 individuals fell victim to their spouse's arsenic poisoning. Just a year prior, in 1985, a man had brutally murdered his entire family under the influence of LSD. With such a terrifying backdrop, Russell Keith Dardine felt the tension rising around him. The thought of raising his family in an increasingly dangerous environment weighed heavily on Keith, especially with a new baby on the way. He confided in his mother, expressing deep concern about their safety. He and his wife, Ruby Elaine Dardine, were contemplating a move back to Mount Carmel, Illinois, where Keith had grown up. He offered no explicit reason for the impending change, yet his unease was palpable. It became evident that he was determined to leave, regardless of job prospects. In a moment of vulnerability, Keith expressed to his mother that there were simply too many unsettling occurrences in Ina. He detailed the murders and rampant robberies, along with a pervasive atmosphere of malice. His words, "I don't like it," resonated with a sense of urgency that his family could not dismiss. Keith's mother found his desire to move rather peculiar, particularly given the family's recent focus on saving. A move of that magnitude would prove costly, contradicting the couple's normally meticulous financial planning. As the days unfolded, the tranquility of the Dardine household would soon be shattered, plunging the community into a state of disbelief. Officers, who had witnessed their fair share of atrocities, arrived at the scene, left in complete shock at the brutality that had transpired. When Keith shared his thoughts with his mother, she found it unsettling. The Dardine family had been meticulously focused on saving money, and the prospect of moving seemed at odds with their careful planning. Such a move would undoubtedly strain their finances. Yet, Keith's resolve was unwavering. That very year, he took the bold step of putting their mobile home up for sale. His instinct to shield his family intensified, evident in his actions. A striking moment came when he firmly turned away a woman who knocked on their door seeking to use the phone, his protective instincts on high alert. His unease was palpable, leaving those around him to ponder what could be causing such distress. The answer, however, would tragically unfold on November 18, 1987. Days had passed since Keith last reported for work, a stark deviation from his reliable nature. For a man who prided himself on diligence and financial stability, his sudden absence sent ripples of concern through his workplace. His boss, alarmed by the silence, attempted to contact Keith at home, but to no avail. With growing worry, he reached out to Keith's parents, only to discover they too had not heard from the family. Anxiety hung in the air, thickening with each passing moment. Recognizing the urgency of the situation, they called the police. Officers arrived at the Dardine mobile home and knocked, but the silence was deafening. One officer peered through a window, and what he saw sent chills down his spine. Motionless figures beneath blankets. The stillness was unsettling, prompting the officers to try the door. As they turned the knob, they were on the verge of uncovering a scene that would haunt them forever. Before we delve deeper into the chilling details of this case, I remind viewers to subscribe for daily true crime content. It truly makes a difference. Upon entering the home, officers were confronted with a scene of unimaginable horror. The lifeless bodies of Ruby Elaine Dardine, her son Peter, and a newborn baby girl lay beneath the blankets, their still forms a stark contrast to the violence that had unfolded. Elaine and Peter were bound and gagged with duct tape, their bodies bearing the marks of a brutal assault. In a tragic twist, Elaine had gone into labor during the attack, giving birth amidst the chaos. The brutality was almost unfathomable. Their skulls were crushed from savage blows, and the horror escalated further. The perpetrator, or perhaps multiple attackers, displayed a complete lack of mercy. They went so far as to bludgeon the newborn to death with a baseball bat, a grim gift that Keith had given to Peter just earlier that year. When the police surveyed the scene, disbelief washed over them. The crime scene was a harrowing tableau, marked by violence that left even seasoned detectives visibly shaken. Yet one of the most perplexing elements was the absence of forced entry, which effectively ruled out the theory of a random robbery gone awry. Valuable items lay untouched, as if the killer had deliberately chosen to leave them behind. Everything remained in its place, undisturbed. Adding to the intrigue was the chilling fact that Ruby Elaine had not suffered sexual assault, complicating the investigation as detectives struggled to pinpoint a motive. The killer had even attempted to clean the scene, but the effort appeared half-hearted, suggesting they had time to spare and were not concerned about being caught. This detail painted a disturbing picture. The perpetrator was in control, executing a horrific plan with alarming precision. And where was Keith, the father? When the authorities arrived, he was conspicuously absent from the trailer, and the family car had vanished without a trace. It didn't take long for the police to shift their focus onto him. As the investigation deepened, the Dardine family's lack of known enemies left authorities grappling with the question of who could commit such an atrocity against a seemingly idyllic family. The absence of forced entry and the unlocked doors implied that robbery was not the motive. Keith's brutal sexual mutilation only added layers of confusion, especially in light of the fact that Elaine had not been assaulted. Investigators found no evidence pointing to extramarital affairs, financial struggles, or grudges against the Dardine family. Although traces of marijuana were discovered within the home, there was no solid proof indicating that the family was involved in drug dealing. This led investigators to believe that the drugs likely belonged to the killer, further complicating the case. Yet, the neighbors reacted with disbelief as whispers of Keith's involvement in the murders circulated. One neighbor candidly expressed their shock, declaring, "It rattled me completely." They were adamant that there was no way Keith could have committed such a heinous act. It was simply out of character for him. A search team of law enforcement officers was quickly dispatched to locate him. However, just as swiftly, the search was called off. In a tragic turn, Keith's lifeless body was discovered by a group of hunters in a nearby wheat field. Not far from the family's home, he had been shot 3 times in the head, an execution-style killing that sent shockwaves through the community. The most horrifying detail was the brutal mutilation that followed. His genital appendage had been severed. Some accounts suggested that the killer had grotesquely stuffed it into Keith's mouth. This chilling act pointed to a perpetrator far more sinister than an ordinary criminal, someone with the mind of a twisted psychopath, capable of unimaginable brutality. It became clear that the killer likely possessed experience, or perhaps harbored a personal vendetta against the Dardine family. As investigators delved deeper into the case, they established that Keith had probably been killed in the family car, indicating that the killer or killers must have driven him there. The blood found inside the vehicle ruled out the theory that Keith had been murdered inside the home. It was determined that all the victims had perished within an hour of one another. As news of the murders spread, an unsettling tension gripped the town. Already grappling with rising crime rates, this case injected a new level of fear into the community. The Dardine family was well liked, with no known enemies, and suddenly, there were no suspects. This left residents questioning who could commit such brutality against a seemingly perfect family. The situation was further complicated by the fact that there was no forced entry into the home, with doors left unlocked. Robbery did not appear to be the motive. The gruesome sexual mutilation of Keith deepened the mystery, especially since there were no signs of sexual assault on Ruby Elaine Dardine. In the wake of the tragedy, the sense of loss and unanswered questions loomed large over the community. The Dardines, once a symbol of normalcy, now embodied the chilling reality of violence that lurked in the shadows, leaving everyone to ponder the motives behind such a heinous act. The chilling details of the crime began to swirl through the town, further complicating the narrative. Keith's gruesome fate, juxtaposed against Elaine's untouched state, created a complex puzzle that investigators were determined to solve. With no clear leads, the case of the Dardine family remained an open wound in the community, begging for closure. As the investigation continued, a sense of urgency hung in the air. The absence of concrete evidence left the detectives struggling as they sought to unravel the truth behind the Dardine family's tragic fate. In a moment of contemplation, Joanne floated a theory that perhaps someone had attempted to pressure Russell Keith Dardine into selling drugs. Alternatively, she speculated that Ruby Elaine Dardine might have rebuffed someone's advances, prompting the killer to lash out in retaliation. This chilling notion compelled the police to explore various possibilities surrounding the case. Among the theories floated was a bizarre suggestion that a satanic cult could be responsible for the murders, allegedly in an effort to appease the devil. However, experts in cult behavior and ritual killings swiftly dismissed this idea, citing a lack of evidence supporting any signs of cult activity. With little to guide them and no clear suspects in sight, investigators honed in on a theory. They surmised that the killer must have gained entry into the Dardine home, abducted Russell Keith Dardine, and ultimately murdered him elsewhere. After committing this heinous act, the perpetrator returned to the residence, where he bound Peter and Ruby Elaine Dardine before brutally ending their lives along with their newborn daughter, Casey. Despite the investigators' efforts, the case soon stagnated, and hope began to wane. The investigation appeared destined for the cold case file, and it seemed as though everyone had resigned themselves to the horror of this crime remaining unsolved. Yet, one person refused to let the memory of her family fade into oblivion. Joanne Dardine, Keith's mother, was determined to keep the brutal legacy of her family alive. She took it upon herself to rally support, collecting over 3,000 signatures to urge the Oprah Winfrey Show to cover the tragic case. Sadly, her heartfelt request was met with rejection, the producers citing the brutality of the crime as inappropriate for daytime television. Undeterred, Joanne shifted her focus, aiming to get the case featured on America's Most Wanted. Initially, the producers responded similarly, echoing the sentiments of Oprah's team. However, after persistent persuasion, they ultimately agreed to air a segment on the murders. In 1998, that long-awaited segment finally aired. Despite the exposure, the high-profile attention failed to yield any new leads or breakthroughs. The police found themselves no closer to unraveling the mystery of the Dardine family murders than they had been back in 1987. Then, after 12 agonizing years, a breakthrough emerged. A new lead surfaced, pointing to a potential suspect named Tommy Lynn Sells. Sells was a notorious serial killer, linked to more than 22 murders across the United States, although he claimed to have taken the lives of over 70 individuals. His history was marred with trauma. Tommy Lynn Sells had endured a tragic childhood. At just 18 months old, he and his twin sister contracted spinal meningitis. While Tommy miraculously survived, his sister did not. Growing up, Tommy lacked guidance and support, his early years steeped in neglect and trauma. By the tender age of 7, he began to abuse substances, seeking escape from the pain that surrounded him. During his childhood, a man from a nearby town took an interest in Tommy. On the surface, this man seemed to genuinely want to help the isolated boy, showering him with gifts and inviting him into his home. However, the facade soon crumbled. The man was ultimately convicted of child molestation, with Tommy among his victims. From the age of 8, Tommy had suffered at the hands of this predator. This horrific trauma would shape the dark trajectory of his life. By the age of 10, Tommy Lynn Sells had dropped out of school, spending his days drinking and smoking. Following a disturbing incident with his grandmother at age 13, his mother, alarmed and distressed, left with his siblings, abandoning Tommy to fend for himself. From that moment on, Tommy found himself without family or stability, drifting from town to town, relying on odd jobs to survive. His life had begun to spiral, setting the stage for the chilling path that lay ahead. As the darkness of his past emerged, Tommy Lynn Sells began to exhibit violent tendencies. One chilling incident involved an attack on a young woman, leaving her profoundly shaken. In a haunting confession, he later claimed that his journey into murder began at the tender age of 16. Sells recounted a story of breaking into a house to confront a man he alleged was harming a young boy. However, investigators found no evidence to substantiate this claim. His narrative grew even more sinister when he asserted that he killed a man named John Cade Sr. in July of 1979, after Cade allegedly caught him in the act of breaking into his home. From that moment on, Sells led a chaotic life, constantly on the run. He traversed from town to town, hitching rides on trains, stealing to survive. His life of evasion came to an abrupt halt in the year 2000 when he was arrested in Del Rio, Texas. This arrest followed a horrifying attack on 2 young girls, 13-year-old Kayleen Harris and 10-year-old Crystal Searles. Tragically, Kayleen did not survive, but Crystal's brave testimony provided the vital details that would ultimately lead to Sells' capture. While in custody, Tommy Lynn Sells confessed to the brutal slaying of the Dardine family, yet his accounts were riddled with inconsistencies, and he continuously altered his narrative. In 2 separate versions, he claimed to have met Russell Keith Dardine at either a truck stop or a pool hall, where, in both scenarios, Keith invited him over for dinner. What began as a seemingly innocent visit, Sells recounted, swiftly devolved into horror when Keith allegedly made a sexual proposition. This supposed affront ignited a rage within Sells, compelling him to retaliate. He forced Keith to drive him to a secluded area, where he savagely killed and mutilated him before returning to the trailer to eliminate the rest of the witnesses. Driven by a fury he claimed had no limits, Sells turned on Elaine and young Peter in a fit of rage. In another version of his story, he omitted the sexual proposition altogether. Instead, he claimed he had simply noticed a "for sale" sign on the Dardines' trailer, seizing the opportunity for violence. After consuming several beers and biding his time, Sells knocked on the door, feigning interest in purchasing the trailer. When Keith opened the door, Sells overpowered him, binding and gagging his family with duct tape. He forced Keith to drive to a field, where he brutally castrated him before shooting him. Returning to the trailer, he committed unspeakable acts against Elaine, and in a horrific culmination, he killed young Peter and the unborn Casey. Following the carnage, Sells meticulously cleaned the scene and drove away in Keith's car, heading towards Benton. Yet, despite his chilling confessions, many of his statements failed to align with official records. Investigators were left with no physical evidence linking him to the Dardine family's brutal murder. In a desperate attempt to justify the discrepancies, Sells claimed, "They say there's no physical evidence tying me to the Dardines, but there wasn't for any of them because they weren't looking for me. I moved. I was always a transient." Afterward, the perpetrator meticulously cleaned the crime scene and drove Keith's car to Benton. As evidence unfolded, it became evident that many of Tommy Lynn Sells' statements did not align with official records. Despite his chilling confession, investigators were unable to uncover a single piece of physical evidence linking him to the brutal slayings of the Dardine family. In an attempt to explain the discrepancies, Sells argued that investigators claimed there was no physical evidence tying him to the Dardines, but insisted that this was because they were not searching for him specifically. He declared, "I moved. I was always a transient." To ascertain the truth, investigators from Illinois sought to bring Sells to their state, hoping he could assist in uncovering crucial evidence or revealing specific details about the crime scene. This would determine whether his claims held any validity. However, a significant obstacle loomed. A Texas law prohibited the transfer of death row inmates to another state. Illinois officials endeavored to obtain an exception, hoping to bring Sells in for further questioning. Unfortunately, their request was denied. Without any concrete evidence linking Tommy Lynn Sells to the Dardine murders, Illinois authorities ultimately chose not to pursue charges. The doubts surrounding Sells' confession continued to mount. Critically, skepticism regarding Sells' narrative did not originate solely from law enforcement. Friends and family of Russell Keith Dardine, the man Sells claimed to have met prior to the murders, expressed their disbelief in his story. They found it hard to accept that Keith could have been acquainted with someone like Sells. A close friend of Keith's expressed disbelief, recalling that he wouldn't even allow a young girl to enter his home to use the phone. The friend added that Keith would certainly never let a 22-year-old man inside. Sells' assertion that Keith had made a homosexual advance toward him raised further eyebrows, as it contradicted everything known about Keith's character. He had never shown any interest in men. The police investigation revealed no evidence to substantiate Sells' allegations. Detectives who interrogated Sells suspected he had fabricated this detail, perhaps to rationalize the horrific crime in his own mind. Sells had a history of employing similar tactics in his confessions to other murders, claiming that his victims had provoked him in some manner. This strategy made it easier for him to justify his heinous actions. As investigators delved deeper into Sells' confessions, it became increasingly apparent that his narrative was riddled with inconsistencies. With each passing day, the belief that he was genuinely responsible for the Dardine murders began to wane. It seemed as if Sells was eager to take credit for these killings, along with many others, merely as a means to manipulate the legal system, making himself appear more dangerous and significant. In the end, despite confessing to over 70 murders and being linked to more than 22, Sells was convicted of only one crime, the murder of Karen Harris on April 4, 2014. He faced execution by lethal injection for that crime, with no convictions tied to the Dardine family murders. Consequently, the shadow of these unsolved murders still looms over the Dardine family. The absence of solid evidence connecting Sells to the Dardine case leaves ample room for doubt, and many questions about that fateful night remain unanswered. Among the most perplexing mysteries is the sheer brutality of the murders. The violence inflicted upon the Dardine family, particularly on Ruby Elaine Dardine and her children, appeared excessively cruel, even for someone like Sells. Some investigators speculated whether the killer might have had a personal connection to the family, but no evidence has ever surfaced to support this theory. Another lingering question pertains to the timeline of the murders. Did Keith return home to find the killer already present, or was he taken hostage during the attack? The absence of forced entry suggests a possible familiarity between the family and their killer, yet without solid leads, this remains merely a theory. The brutal violence inflicted upon the Dardine family, particularly on Ruby Elaine Dardine and her children, struck investigators as excessively cruel, even for someone of Sells' notorious reputation. Some speculated that the killer might have had a personal connection to the family, yet no evidence ever surfaced to substantiate this theory. Another lingering question remained: the timeline of the murders. Did Russell Keith Dardine return home to find the killer waiting, or was he taken hostage during the attack? The absence of forced entry suggested that the family may have known their assailant. Yet with no substantial leads, this theory remained speculative at best. For those eager to delve deeper into the case of Tommy Lynn Sells, the chorus of voices imploring for further investigation grows louder. Meanwhile, opinions on the Dardine murders remain divided. Was Sells truly the perpetrator of this heinous crime, or do the doubts echoed by law enforcement and Keith's family bear weight? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below, as we remain curious to know where you stand on this haunting case. If you appreciate the way we illuminate these stories and wish to support further explorations into such cases, please hit that like button and subscribe for more in-depth investigations. Thank you for joining us once again.